Coming here, I have to say, is a real pleasure. It feels a bit, I have to say, like a foreign land. I used to live just 23 years ago by the cemetery of Ixelles, and I thought, I know where it is. I used to run around the VUB campus. And either the roads have changed or my memory has gone, which the latter is more likely. And I got lost, which was fine, and happily I was found. But coming here and speaking feels like a foreign land in many other ways. And this is where I'd like to begin my talk. It's a bit of a foreign land because I'm aware as a British national, I'm also ethnically half Czech, so they're the other so-called bad boys or girls of European integration. Coming here and wagging my finger about what is taking place in the euro area, despite the fact it's huge significance for my country as much as for anyone else. Our politicians have already done enough of it, so one has to be very careful what we say. For the first time ever, you really do feel as an EU state you're looking on something from the outside. But it's also a foreign land for another reason. And this is that if you actually look at what's taking place in terms of how Europeans, particularly those in the euro area, manage their taxes, their public finances, this is changing in quite a significant way. And that's what I really want to talk to you about for the next half hour, about how the basic compact, as I see it, this is governed states or public management of budgets, taxes, etc., is shifting. This strikes me as something very interesting. It transcends rather trite debates about which football team you support, Europe or your nation state. And whatever happens, I think, with some of the formal arrangements in the euro area, it's likely to continue and be quite pervasive. Now, I had some PowerPoints. I don't know if it's possible to show them, but if not, I'll go ahead and read from them. What I want to do in this lecture is, first of all, tell you about the basic deal that historically states have engaged in with their citizens in relation to taxation and budgets, and then see how it's changed already and how it might change after 2014. And think, is this something we're happy about? And what shifts are taking place? Now, if you think about it, someone comes along and says, I'm going to take close to half your money. I'm going to spend, probably in terms of the national economy, close to half of it to a little bit more because I'm going to borrow. That is offering an awful lot of goodwill. You probably wouldn't give your best friend that amount of money, let alone a bunch of strangers who we've already heard, in many cases, both at a supranational and at a national level, enjoy quite low trust. And when we look at how it's evolved, we've had it for some time, but it wasn't taken for granted. The systems of taxation were contested and took a long time to evolve. So what was necessary for them? And if you were looking, what role, as I'm a lawyer, did law play in them? Okay? And that is where we have to start our story. Because historically, if you talked about law, we wouldn't say, certainly in my country, we studied budgetary law. But what role did law play? And what is the deal? Or at least the historic deal. Now I'm going to suggest to you that there were three roles that law played, because deciding about taxes is a difficult thing. Who should do the taxing? How much should be taxed? Who should spend the money? Where it should go? And because these things are so difficult and so contested, it's relied on three important elements. Now the first is you have to bound the political system. We don't have yet a world taxation system. Similarly, and I know things are particularly contested here in Belgium, but if you actually look at most cities at the small scale, their capacity to raise taxes is quite small. So you have to have something that allows you to say, yes, this is a political unit that I'm happy being taxed for. And if you look at what happened historically with the central concepts of the state, they were bound up with taxation. So if you look at how we understand certain concepts, they started almost from the right to tax. So I'll just go through them briefly. And this is just on the bounding of the political system. First of all, the notion of sovereignty emerged in the 16th century, and it was partly linked, amongst other things, between the idea that the king's personal property was different from his or her public property. Public property could not be given away or administered by the monarch. It was just the king in those terms. It was a res quasi sacri, and it was also a res fisci. It was something that was there, immutable forever. So there was the king who would eventually die like all human beings, but the king's body, which was the sovereign, would continue, along with the land, which could be taxed for the public good. It was an idea right from the very beginning that if the king extracted money because it was so contentious, he had to do it for the political system. Okay? Right from the beginning, it was linked to the idea of sovereignty. Similarly, if one looks at ideas of citizenship and the social contract, people like Rousseau in the 18th century said, a central part of the social contract is, on the one hand, the right to property, protection from arbitrary treatment, at least in liberal societies, by the state. And on the other hand, there was a recognition that the state needed money for good things and the right to tax. And that this, because there was an increasing suspicion of this required some public sphere, some public autonomy, citizen engagement. It's linked very strongly with this notion of citizenship. Once again, a legal concept. And the third role that law has had in this, so I don't know, how do I, we just, this is unbalanced. That was it, but it seems to have unbalanced on this slide. And the third role that law has had in relation to bounding of political systems is stabilizing expectations. Historically, we didn't have a public finances law. We had a tax law, which said who could tax and put limits on how they could tax us. They couldn't do it arbitrarily. They had to do it in a non-discriminatory way. But it was there to stabilize expectations and coordinate things. So if you looked at the first element of what law was about, bounding the political system, sovereignty, citizenship, and stabilization of expectations. The second thing law has historically done on taxes is allocation of decision-making. It says, it puts in place checks and balances, standard thing that parliaments should approve budgets. These checks and balances stop people taxing the wrong people, taxing too much, taxing too little. They are also there, however, particularly with tax for another reason, to give citizens voice and to act as containers for conflict. If you think about elections, the standard thing about elections is tax and spend. And one of the things that political systems do well is to ensure that we do it in a peaceful way, even though there's no right answer. We all have different views. So they act to contain the conflict, rather than just, I go down and rob some local village, as well as acting as traditional constitutional checks and balances. And the third thing that happens with law, and I don't want to say too much, it's at a symbolic level. So the first one is, if you like, system formation. The second is classic constitutional law, and the third is symbolically. And I'll say what we argue about law and taxes, that they do two things. First of all, they're associated with, both theologically but also the nation state, as giving rise to a way of life. If you want to use the idea of a father figure or a mother figure, the budget gives rise to the social state, to the social contract. It allows us to be citizens. Without that, we would back to some sort of bare life. So it's this authority as almost, if you like, giving birth to us, the father figure. The second thing about that law does, and I use the master-slave thing, and it's from Hegel, this. He says, why did the slave always accept the authority of the master? Because it's such an egregious relationship. And at the end of the day, the slave got fed. That was the only reason. And Hegel argues that that idea is present in many political relations, that ultimately you accept authority because you need resources to live. And he argued that we just had to overcome our fear of death and our fear of this for true freedom. But this relationship is also present in budgetary relations, that we have budgets to survive, and without them, life would be pretty miserable. So those are the things that, if you look at it, historically we've used law and budgets to do. How is it changing? Now, if I could just go to the next slide, and I'll go through this very quickly, and it's been described much better than I could do. But just what is happening at the moment in terms of the law. Okay, where are we? You have two regimes. I'm going to call one a system of bonded government, another system of risk management. But the first one is for the states that are receiving finances through the European Stability Mechanism. The European Stability Mechanism consolidated most other systems of financial support into a fund of 700 billion euros. It doesn't actually loan the money, it actually guarantees the loans. It's a little bit less generous than was said, at 3%. It's still well above what you could get in the market rates. It's not so dissimilar from a student loan, at least in my country. Not generous, but a bit more generous than on your credit card. And it's run as a private company by a board of governors, who are largely Euro finance ministers. The normal rule of thumb is unanimity voting, but they delegate most of the work to the Commission, the ECB and the IMF to develop memorandums of understanding with the states that have received support. And there's then a sort of drip feed thing where, as the state meets the terms of the memorandum of understanding, financial support is released. That is one mechanism, which affects quite a number of euro area states, and one has to say there are some who are on the edge still, maybe of having to receive it. We will wait and see what happens. I hope this doesn't happen with countries like Austria and Slovenia, who've been quite close to the precipice at times. It is a very labile situation. I'll go just to the next slide, please. Now, for other states, we have a system of what I'm going to call risk management. And what you have, and this is political economy, is something, I would say I don't know if I want to call it the ideology, but the ethos of what is taking place is something called the common pool resource problem. Now, the common pool resource problem was historically used for public finances. And its argument goes like this, that one of the reasons we have problems with public finances is that there are more taxpayers than beneficiaries of public spending. So at elections, taxpayers, it's economists who believe this, by the way, taxpayers will obviously vote for low taxes. In between elections, beneficiaries of public expenditure push and lobby and capture for increased expenditure. So you get this gap, which is you agree a pool, but people drink too much from it. And most of the economists sort of start with the problem that you should do what people say at elections, rather than thinking it might be a case of majoritarian abuse and bargain match. Now, what has happened, if you look at the three procedures which are together in the six-pack, is elements of this are present in the three procedures which diversified, which is previously the Stability and Growth Pact. For excessive deficits, this is the most well-known one. States should, in principle, keep their annual deficits below 3% and try and get their total debt below 60% of GDP. It's a little less formulaic than that. They argue this is the classic thing, that states year on year were just spending more money than they had, and they should try and not do too much of it. But it was then extended, and the Commission, to be fair, pushed for this well before the crisis, actually, to macroeconomic imbalances. A misnomer, because it's actually about microeconomic performance. But the macroeconomic imbalance case covers someone like Spain. Spain met all the indicators, but it obviously had been lending money very hard to sustain a housing boom. When the crash happened, money dried up. Not only the banking sector was hit, but also the housing sector. And the argument was it's an imbalanced economy. So what you had was a particular sector, once again, sucking up money from the general pool, and this had to be balanced out. And then finally, and this is both the six-pack and in the fiscal compact, this idea that you should do it over the long term. This is the structural annual balance, and the argument is that present generations want to suck up all the money at the expense of future generations. So what you have is, depending on your debt, a commitment across the cycle, irrespective of any one year, for your deficit not to be greater than 0.5% or 1%. And the idea is, in all cases, you try and protect this common pool. This is the ethos, okay? That states should not risk these things. These activities of taking too much debt, either long-term or short-term, or fiddling your economy, you try and avoid this. Have the next slide. And very briefly, there's a series of sanction procedures which will never be used. I don't think they will be. I know the Commission, we will wait and see. And the argument was, the argument you'll hear from Angela Merkel is that historically the states didn't apply by the rules, and so they brought in three different procedures where states can be fined huge amounts. These procedures, all three of them, strengthen the position of the Commission, that largely it can recommend sanctions or findings, and the Council has to veto it by qualified majority at some point. So the argument was, you don't let beggars or thieves be choosers, as are the national finance ministers, you put it all in the hands of the Commission, and you shame national finance ministers into not doing it. And on paper, it's a very rule-bound system. If I was to talk to you about the law, it would be very boring, and I couldn't do it in 30 minutes because there's about 60 pages of it. And a large part of it goes through details. Next slide, please. So you have a series of economic goods, and then alongside the supranational sanctions, there are a series of rules at a domestic level that have to be entrenched. Everyone's heard about the commitment in the constitutional documents or quasi-constitutional documents to a balanced budget, which was in the fiscal compact, but probably, in my view, even more significant are the series of procedures that all states have had to put in for fiscal councils, fiscal rules, systems of statistics. At every micro level, at every ministry, you have new experts coming along to check public spending. Things that really didn't exist anywhere in the world before the 90s. And alongside this, the idea is that these will be in place so the experts will be checking what's happening at a national level, and then if states really behave very badly, which many of them are, according to these rules, the Commission will come in and do a risk assessment, and only if the risk assessment is really bad will the Council veto it. And that is the Angela Merkel view of what's taking place. And this is the view that's also taken by the indignados, who say this is outrageous, that if you actually took these things seriously, Italy would be in recession for the next 5,000 years, because it would take it that long to get its debt down or to hit a structural balance. You're fining bankrupts. If a state's bust, why fine it? All these arguments, and this is too neoliberal. The social consequences have all been talked about. I don't buy this. And the reason I don't buy this story is, if you look at the next slide, what had happened and continues to happen. Oh, forget this. Forget that for the time being. Just go forward a bit. Next one, please. No, forward a little bit more. Another way. Well, I'll tell you what happened whilst we're sorting out the slide. That's my problem. Is what happened is, if you actually looked at the history prior to 2008, this argument that the Council was misbehaving, was not sanctioning deviant behaviour. Certainly that was the case for France and Germany in 2004-2005, and maybe once for Portugal. It wasn't for any other state, if you actually looked at the rules. What was happening is, every time the Commission made a recommendation, and this continued after the crisis, the Council would agree there was an excessive deficit or something else. And then what would happen would be, the state would enter into a plan with the Commission's agreement, which would be monitored and recalibrated on and on and on. So these things that we're talking about are not rules, they're triggers. And that is the only way you can see this. And I'll give another example to say things haven't changed since the crisis in a moment, which is what took place on the 31st of May this year. Now what happens is that many states cannot meet these criteria for good reason or bad. And so there is a finding that they have imbalances or an excessive deficit, or that they don't have a balanced budget, and they then have to submit plans, in all cases, to the Commission and to ECOFIN, the Council, to say this is what we're going to do. And the Commission, because it knows there's high costs to getting it wrong, has to be tentative about sanctioning these states. Because if it is vetoed, if a Commission recommendation for fines is vetoed, it's got a situation where that state can turn around and say, look, a qualified majority of states agreed with us. It's you against the rest of the world. So on the one hand, there's a threat of sanction against the states when they're in these plans. The other, Commission knows it can't push the boat too far. And so you had a series of situations where most states were in excessive deficit and were gradually let off. And this reached its culmination the 31st of May this year, where all states were recommended by the Commission no longer to be in excessive deficit, with the exception, I think, of Belgium. Now, the funny thing about this was that Belgium's performance, as many of you might know, is actually better than France. And the French excessive deficit the day afterwards, the French Cour de compte said, well, the French figures are not that reliable. It's actually much worse than it appears. And I say this not as a criticism of the Commission. I just say this is a process of management that is taking place. So what you have is not a system of rules that creates a ruleless state. It just puts states into a system of co-management. Now, where does that take us? So we've got two systems. The stability mechanism, which is decided by the Memorandum of Understanding, and this, the fiscal compact for the other states. How does that change, if I can just go on for another 10 minutes, the relationship between citizens, taxpayers, and public institutions, be they national ones or the EU ones? Is it possible just to flick forward in the slides if possible? Just go on a bit more. I'll skip that. Right, start with the back one. Thank you. Now, where does this take us to? Now, I say that at the moment, and I think the Commission, wants to bring these together. Well, not just the Commission, or the Commission, the Eurogroup, and the European Council. This was the view of all three institutions in December. But you currently have two systems of management in place. You have one that's based, I'm going to call it, a community of risk management. This is those states who are not receiving support from the European Stability Mechanism, but they're struggling to meet their targets under excessive deficit. They don't have a balanced budget. Their economy is not balanced, whatever that means, but one can see that there are certain vulnerabilities, even for the most pernickety lawyer. They fall into this. So these are most states, I'd have to say. Most euro area states. And I have to say most non-euro area states as well. And then you have certain states, which I'm going to call bonded government, where the relationship is slightly different. It's the idea of the bond. The bond is an Indian word. And it means tying parties together. I'm not talking about bonds as in the financial markets. And what you have with this is a slightly different relationship. Parties are tied in, where I'm going to say the law expresses a relationship, but it doesn't constitute it. If you look at the MOUs, they're constantly being renegotiated. It's an expression of what they do, but there's one party that is dominant, everyone knows. It's a situation of a bank with a bankrupt. You're fine if you're a big bankrupt, but once you're a small bankrupt, which most states, most of the JIPs are now, it's not so good. So community of risk management, what happens is you have a series of sanctions which can be applied against states that engage in too risky behaviour. This is how I see it working. One of the reasons I think Belgium was sanctioned was there was a crisis of government. It wasn't doing much about things. Its performance was certainly a lot better than Spain's was a few years ago, but the argument was Belgium wasn't trying. Secondly, it's highly unlikely that large states will be sanctioned in the same way as small states, in my view. I think I'll wait to see when Germany is sanctioned. Okay, I might be. The Commission will claim to me that it's not the case, and I'm sure they will go through with everything. But this is just the way regulation works. The risks are different. And thirdly, you have to think about the cost of sanction. When this has all been threatened, be it against Spain, Hungary, or Belgium, the governments have gone around, and, or at least it's been reported in all the press, made it very clear, will this sanction actually help? So this is how the risk management works. And then you have the bonded government. Now, how does it change things? If I go to the next slide. Our view of life. Let's get back to the bonding of political systems. I said it was all about sovereignty, citizenship, and law stabilising expectations about how we fill in our tax returns. And if I've got time, I've got another 5-10 minutes. I'll say a few words about what happened after 2014. Now, if you look at them, things change a bit. For states, if you look here in Belgium, Belgium is still, Belgium is still sovereign. But now its sovereignty is regulated for the risks it poses to the other states by deviant economic or fiscal behaviour. And so it is sovereign to do what it wants, but there is a threat if it attacks the systemic values of the Eurozone, causes a real mess, or just engage in deviant behaviour, or it does something that's perceived as very risky. It may be sanctioned, and the other thing that we take into account, as I said earlier, deciding whether to sanction us, is the effectiveness of the sanction. If you look in terms of citizenship is changing. In the discourse, one has to say, across Europe, that citizenship, which is now affected in really quite significant ways by world capital markets. And there was a lot of term in the 90s about how we ensured that citizens were sort of immune from globalization or had at least a certain security against globalization. This has changed now. If you read the current literature and if you look at the legislation, citizenship is increasingly, you have to think about not just your commitments to your fellow existing citizens, but to future citizens. So if you look at the deal that is set out in the fiscal compact, and the way it is often expressed, it's not just you have to do this as Belgians to make sure that the Dutch don't pay for it, which I don't think would be too bothered about, many Belgians. I wouldn't if I was Belgian. But you have to do this for future Belgians' sakes. So you have independent fiscal councils, fiscal rules, you have politicians talking about future generations. Citizenship now has an intertemporal dimension which it never used to, much more explicitly. And this is expressed now in all the kind of new sort of laws, which are mind-numbingly boring, I think, but mind-numbingly important, unfortunately. Fiscal rules. A large part of government is now laws about what spending you will do over the medium term. Fiscal responsibility rules, sanctions that will attach to you if you don't meet these targets. New independent fiscal councils, offices of budget responsibility, this whole idea that you have independent assessors and auditors of government spending in a new way you didn't have previously. All these things are now regulated by law. Previously they weren't. And this is a whole new technology of government, it's for good or for bad. But it's changed what we have. And not just in the euro area, I would say in my country you find elements of all these things as well. Except the first one is slightly worse for us because we're punished by the markets in a much more aggressive way, arguably. Now with bonded governments, it's slightly different. What happens there is, I think you can talk about a division of sovereignty. I don't want to talk too much about Pringle. I thought the Pringle judgment was one of the worst judgments the Court of Justice ever gave. It was tough measures for tough times, but Pringle concerned the European Stability Mechanism. And what the European Stability was a challenge from Ireland. And it was a challenge that basically said, amongst other things, you're setting up this fund and you're giving powers to the EU institutions, which they just don't have under the treaties. So our body, the European Central Bank, that was really just meant to print money, is now monitoring whether to close public services in Greece. The Commission has a whole wide array of tasks. Now and to cut a very long story short, what the court said this is fine. It said the states are masters here. They can largely contract out these institutions, provided it doesn't change their essential characteristics. Except essential characteristics for the Commission was decided as policy making. So it can do pretty much anything. But the effect of that was that the ESM has an independent, quasi-sovereign or quasi-autonomous presence. That if you think about the legal status of the ESM, and it's a body, you've got to remember it's a private company, formally, that deals with contracts. It has something that is completely independent, and it is governing large parts of these countries. Maybe indirectly, maybe in collaboration with the governments, but you have a divided sovereignty. It might be necessary, it might be all that there was at the time, and the best thing that can be done, a very generous act from the other euro area states, but it is a division of sovereignty. Secondly, and I can say this, now this isn't a nasty British Eurosceptic position, this is the view of the Portuguese Constitutional Court and the German Constitutional Court, that it is posing real challenges for traditional views of citizenship. Both in the creditor states, so states that see themselves as splashing out the cash, and in states who are perhaps less happily receiving the cash. In Germany, in the European Stability Mechanism judgment, I think it's going to be December, isn't it, where they're holding their hearings now. There's a challenge in Germany to the European Stability Mechanism on the argument that it compromised against Germany's constitution, German budgetary autonomy. And the court refused, the German Constitutional Court, refused temporary injunctions, but they're now hearing the final case. But what it did say, amongst other things, was that the German Parliament had to be a lot more involved in the running of the European Stability Mechanism, as many of you know, both in approving final decisions, be it loans or calls for capital, but also being able to monitor what was going on. And this went, if you like, to public autonomy, to voice. That if we as taxpayers, this is how the Germans say it, are having to levy this money, we have to have a voice in how it's decided. It's a very orthodox view of citizenship. And they said it was good. Now, the Acordão 187213, which was the judgment in April of the Portuguese Constitutional Court, this went to alleged discrimination between public service workers and other workers and how the costs were distributed in austerity measures that the Portuguese state had, it had set up. It had decided what it was going to do. And this was found to violate certain Portuguese constitutional definitions of citizenship. Now, whether that was right or wrong, one can argue whether it was a very long judgment, the Portuguese Constitutional Court's judgment, that showed a claim knowledge for economics that most judges don't have. But once again, it went to something about citizenship that was quite important. This idea of equality before the law, equality before taxation, which was compromised by the MOU. What had happened was the Portuguese government just thought, where can we get the money from? And had done a bit of a slash and burn raid, and had not thought enough, according to the Portuguese Constitutional Court at least, about the implications for citizenship. So in this, there was a little bit of a problem. And the final thing is that if you look at where the law is it's not in the stability mechanism. It's governed, of course, by a memorandum of understanding. It's a contract, nothing else. And even if you meet the contract, that doesn't help you necessarily. I mean, we hope it does. It might, but what matters, of course, and this was made very, very well, I thought, is absolutely right, is return to the capital markets. And it is return to the capital markets that is the goal of this, which is a totally unstable goal. It might happen quicker, and hopefully this is the case. It might happen more quickly than you want. It might happen less quickly than you want. Of course, one of the challenges for some of these states is as their economies have shrunk, it's made it yet harder for them to meet the targets. And of course, it obviously depends a little bit on how much capital there is around. Okay. Now, I wanted to say just one word, and then I'll stop. If I could just go to the next slide, about what might happen after this. I'll just say a little bit about this, and then I'll stop. Allocation and decision making. If you look at what's taking place with the fiscal compact, it is completely fluid. The decision making, there are no classic checks and balances once the state enters into the trigger. New categories are invented. Good example is macroeconomic imbalances. Any state that had a macroeconomic imbalance last year was Cyprus. Cyprus, it was all basically their economy hung around two banks and the loans they'd made. If that is not an imbalanced economy, I don't know what is. But it was not held to have an excessive imbalance in the first year. What happened was a new category was invented called severe imbalances. Okay, so you get massaging of legal terms. I don't want to sound too negative about this. I think this is just necessary. But once you go into the system of co-government, this is what happens. It's a very fluid term where adaptability is the key. What matters is the common pool resource is protected. So what one finds in this is that now with budgets, these will be looked at first by the Commission, these are national budgets, then by ECOFIN, and national parliaments, I think I'm right in saying, under Regulation 473/2013, get 1 month to approve the national budget, which is December. This is assuming you don't take any time off for Christmas. If you take a week off for Christmas, as most national parliaments do, it's a little bit less. So you see actors that were historically regarded as a bit profligate being moved out of the system, okay, which I don't think they will like. Now, what happens with bonded government is conversely quite interesting. Formerly, if you look at decision making, it's got no legitimacy at all. It's the Commission and, if you look at Cyprus, whoever happened to be in the room at the time, and then they had to go back and renegotiate it. It looks, they agree the deal between the Commission, the ECB, and maybe the IMF, and whoever else is around, and then gets ratified by the finance ministers. However, what has happened time and time again is that states have had to go to their parliaments to get this approval. We're talking about the debtor states. Now, this has actually proved quite difficult for them to do, because it's happened so quickly there's been no consultation. And so what you've had is, in many states, very strong parliamentary assertiveness, both from the creditor states and the debtor states. And if one looks at this, parliaments have played quite a strong role, but at the risk of a huge cleavage between executive and parliament. The traditional role has disappeared. And then the one final slide, and then I'll stop. And now this is where it gets into the symbolism. Will it all work? Well, we hope so, of course. We really do hope so. But there is a question that's raised about the authority of all this. How is this working? What is the symbolism of it all? What forces people to pay their taxes and not go on the streets? Go back to what I said at the beginning. You wouldn't give your best friend half your money. So why should you give a bunch of strangers this? Well, in this new regime of co-management, okay, if you look at what's taking place for why you should give your money, why you should pay your taxes, I'd have to say this is the same in the UK. What has happening here is you're getting a new authority figure, this idea not of someone, if I go back to what I said earlier, who gives rise to your community or feeds you, but of the leader. Now, the difference with the leader as an authority figure in symbolic politics is that they're visionaries. They can see something that you can't. So what happens is that we will often agree with leaders because they'll say, we can take you to the promised land, or we can avert disaster. So if you look at the fiscal compact, this is what we find, these leadership qualities. Both at the supranational level, the Commission and the ECB are given huge new roles. What is the reason for their roles? They have an expertise and a vision, systems of peer review that the state doesn't. But you also find it within the state. Who is getting the power within states now? It's finance ministries, but also fiscal councils, fiscal rules, statisticians. These are in some ways more important than classic elected politicians. And the argument is that elected politicians, they won't say this, are fools, some of them, whereas these people are experts and their vision will take us to promised land of hopefully a better economy. By contrast, in bonded government, no one can claim the same thing. What's happening in bonded government? Now, the problem with the visionary is that they can be a snake oil salesman. That we hope they're right, but if they're not, then the disappointment is always greatest. Okay, that is the problem with visionaries. If you get the vision right, no one thanks you for it. This was just what they were promised. So you better deliver the future, which, as Freud said, is a pretty unhappy thing to have to do. Now, with bonded government, if one looks at what's taking place, this is a very different relationship. The only reason the Commission, the ECB, the ESM has the powers that they do in Greece is not because they have some vision, it's because they have the money. And the quote was made earlier about the national governments being disenfranchised, unpopular at the moment in Europe. There is a reason for that. Political scientists have looked at this. Voters don't like them because they think they're useless. And they have the lowest popularity in the states that are experiencing the greatest crisis. And it's because they've become disempowered. They know that they don't govern anymore, they just police. Okay? And this is why, if you talk to many Greek or Portuguese citizens, they can tell you the Memorandum of Understanding backwards. This has been extremely well covered in their national newspapers. And what it is all about is an authority in terms of provision of resources. Now, the problem of the master-slave relationship is not simply that it's an egregious one in terms of dependence, but it expresses no solidarity. So if you think of it from both terms, you haven't heard many thanks from the Portuguese and the Greeks to the Germans, But simultaneously, the Germans aren't feeling particularly generous about the way they're giving the money. And I mean, the British were even worse to the Irish, by the way. And that is a real problem. That when you put it in terms of mutual dependence, I'm doing this to make you eat, no one has friends like that. And that is, I think, the problem of the current crisis. It reshapes, in quite a profound way, how we think about the bargain that we've historically agreed to why we pay our taxes and why we want our social services. And that's nothing to do with whether you want a European community or national community. It just goes to the nature of that bargain. And I'll stop there.